freedom in our lifetime. So that also includes what we have to do in terms of the work of the organization. That is what we expect from all of you. Comrades, before we entered here, we met briefly with workers from Port Steve Dory, who say that they've been appealing to the labor desk here in Nelson Mandela region of the EFF, and the kind of assistance that they've been given has been less than satisfactory. That is unacceptable. The leadership of the region, all of the people who have been interacting with these fighters, with these workers, who have been demanding money, must be held accountable, because in the EFF, the labor desk does not charge people if we want to help workers. We help them for free. So we want to assure the workers of Port Steve Dory that Sinivile Mataba, we're going to intervene in all the problems that we are facing there and make sure that we have got your problems resolved. Not these things of being sent up and down by the leadership which otherwise is supposed to assist you. So that we are going to deal with, and you must rest assured that we are going to deal with it much more adequately. Now, comrades, I'm going to start from the conclusion in terms of presenting this lecture on the so-called Freedom Day. And the conclusion is to characterize that what we have in South Africa is a neo-colonial, racist, capitalist, incapable state. So the proper characterization, the proper definition of what South Africa is a neo-colonial, racist, capitalist, but also incapable state. That is what defines this territory we call South Africa. And that is the reason why we are still facing the problems that we are facing in universities, in our communities. That is why when the Commander-in-Chief speaks yesterday, he says, what is this freedom without water? What is this freedom without proper sanitation? What is this freedom without access to quality education? What is this freedom with hunger? What is this freedom with joblessness? So we're going to give a clearer context of where that comes from. It is very fulfilling that we are talking, majority of you are students in the universities here and the TVET colleges here in Nelson Mandela, coming from different parts of the province and from different parts of South Africa. So the average age of students is 26 years, all over the world and here in South Africa. So what this means is that majority of you never had to have a lived experience of what happened in 1994 and before 1994. You have only been told that this is what happened. You do not have a lived experience of where we come from. And as an organization, as a movement, we have an obligation to always speak to what is this so-called freedom that we're talking about. We do so because there is beginning to be a growing gap between the so-called intellectuals and in universities and what happens in society. There is growing gap between institutions of higher learning and society as a whole. Majority of academics or so-called intellectuals, particularly in the social sciences, are not involved in any form of struggle. They just theorize. They speak theory without inspiring any action. And Lenin is correct to say that all theorization that does not inform action is sterile. So if you just theorize without real action, you do not know what you're talking about. How do we contextualize this? It's like you going to read a book on how to drive a car. You study, you memorize, you talk about how a car is driven. And you wake up and want to drive a car without having trialed yourselves in practice. It will be disastrous. No matter how theory you have imbibed in driving, if you are not involved in struggle, you will never understand that. There are so many fake intellectuals in South Africa who claim to understand the revolution, who claim to understand Marxism, who claim to understand the ground, who every time the EFF speaks, they want to correct, no, this is not correct, this is not right, but they have never even organized 5 people behind any idea that they stand for. They are just theorizing. So we must all appreciate that our struggle must always be balanced by a proper understanding of theory and practice. That is what should define all of us. You know, we say we ascribe to Marxism. Karl Marx was an intellectual, but he was also an organizer. Lenin was an organizer. He was an intellectual. He led the revolution, the greatest socialist revolution. He was an intellectual, but also an organizer of ordinary people who could marshal all the forces, who could spend time with students. You must go and read the so many lectures and presentations that Vladimir Lenin gave to students, patiently, because he understood that at the center of any revolution is the ability to reproduce yourself, is the ability to ideologically and politically reproduce yourself. You can't call yourself a revolutionary, you can't call yourself a fighter if you can't reproduce yourself ideologically, if you can't give back, if you are barren, you're not a revolutionary, if you can't convince your neighbor, your friends, your parents, everyone to believe in what you believe in, you are not a revolutionary. You are just a fellow traveler, you are just there. So the task of revolutionaries, particularly you who now understands what we stand for, is to reproduce yourself. Thomas Sankara was an intellectual, and he led a revolution. He died at the age of 38, Thomas Sankara, because he led a clear revolution that was informed by clear theory. Gqeberha, he theorized, he wrote books, we refer to him every day. We always quote that claim no easy victories, tell no lies. We take that from Gqeberha, who was a revolutionary, who was an intellectual in terms of what happens. And that is what should inform all of us. Kwame Nkrumah did not just theorize about Pan-Africanism. He did not just theorize about a pan-continental agenda. He practiced it. He mobilized all parts of the African continent to appreciate that the liberation of Africa has to happen from Cape to Cairo. It can't be just the small enclaves, so-called countries, that must be liberated. He played a leading role everywhere. He inspired a generation of freedom fighters in many parts of the African continent and the world. We still learn from Kwame Nkrumah up to this day because he understood that there must be a relationship between theory and practice. But what is happening in South Africa today We have got fake intellectuals, people who call themselves intellectuals. They theorize, they hijack social movements. They take leaders of social movements and turn them into nothing. They tried that with political parties. They tried that with the economic freedom fighters. When they fail, they stand on the sidelines and insult the EFF and say the EFF is not socialist, is not Marxist, is fascist, is so on and so forth. Because they are barren. They can't reproduce themselves. They can't inspire any action. Now, comrades, there are so many definitions and conceptualizations of this so-called freedom that we have today. Some say that 1994, 27 years ago, represented the defeat of apartheid and racism. Some say that it was a defeat of racist capitalism. Some say that it was the decolonization of the last colonized African country. Some say that 1994 represented the beginning of a rainbow nation. Some say that it was the beginning of a phase that is going to give a platform for struggle for socialism. Some say it is an important phase in building what they call National Democratic Society. Some say that we had a peaceful transition in South Africa. So I'm going to talk to all of those and respond to each and every question. I am, however, going to spend a lot of time on this thing that South Africa is decolonized. Because we are not decolonized. We're going to give context of what is decoloniality and what is decolonization? And how does coloniality define all of us and our existence today? That is what the essence of what we're going to talk about today will present all. And of course, at conclusion, we're going to talk to what is to be done. What is the immediate task of all revolutionaries? Let's start with the first issue of peaceful transition. Most of you are taught in classes that South Africa had a peaceful transition from apartheid to so-called democracy. But the existing numbers, confirmed numbers, is that more than 20,000 people died between 1990 and 1994. But they say it's a peaceful transition. Do you know why they say it's a peaceful transition? It's because no white people were killed. Because it was only black people who were killed or were sponsored by the system to kill each other. Because it was Chris Ann who was killed, they say it was a peaceful transition because no white life was lost in that transition. And then we'll be told that Mandela has mastered a peaceful transition from apartheid to democracy. It is peaceful because white people did not die. Because in the colonial system, in the mind of white people, black lives do not matter. It doesn't matter if a black person is alive or dead. That is why they call it a peaceful transition in terms of what happened. And then they say the end of apartheid meant the end of racism. That is absolute rubbish. South Africa continues to be the most racist nation in the world, institutionally and individually. We are still defined on racial terms, where the white minority continue to control our land, to control our wealth. The first time white kids have contact with black people is to see them as domestic workers, as gardeners. So when they grow up and then black people say we want to be equal to you, they don't understand. Because at home, they knew this one is a gardener, the other one as a domestic worker who sleeps in a back room, who receives lesser respect and treatment than pets of white people. You know, white people, they spend more money in their dogs and cats than they spend on their domestic workers. They put their dogs and cats in medical aid when their domestic workers do not have any medical aid. That is what we are still experiencing today in the so-called freedom in South Africa. So these white people and the white kids, they grow up under such an environment of black inferiority, of black insignificance. That is why they always think less of us. Whatever we do, even when we become much more cleverer and much more understanding than them, they still think of us as garden boys, as kitchen girls. And that is at the center of racism. Racism is still an instrument of class exploitation in South Africa. Racism still defines privilege in South Africa. You know, the lives of white people. So if you were to take white people, engage them alone by themselves, and let's say white people in South Africa were a country by themselves, they will be amongst the top 10 most developed nations in the world in terms of the levels of unemployment, which is less than 10%, actually less than 7%. So amongst white people, unemployment is less than 7%. Meaning that for every 10 white people, less than 1 is the one who doesn't have a job. And most certainly coming from a family where they've got something. They continue to own our land. They own everything. That is 27 years of the so-called freedom that we are supposed to be celebrating. What is this freedom without the land? That is where we are. But we'll be told that 1994, April 27, meant that we have defeated racism. We have economic apartheid in South Africa. We are still living in an apartheid neo-colonial state. That is what defines us in terms of where we come from. The other one, which does not even deserve any intellectual engagement or critique, is this nonsense that South Africa is a rainbow nation. It's not, it's absolute rubbish. It's imaginations of those that had believed that just by substituting politicians in the union buildings in 1994, that will mean that we have got a nation. We do not have such in the manner that it is. There's this thing that we are in an important phase of a national democratic revolution. We are not. I will talk to that in greater detail. Now, how do we get to all these things that we are talking about? Do you know, comrades, mostly students, you will appreciate something that has been happening. There's been something called knowledge systems genocide in the African continent of colonized people. They call it epistemic genocide, where they destroy everything else that we know. Our knowledge systems mean nothing in the society that we live in. That is why when they tell the history of South Africa, they start in 1652. What that means is that the so-called history of South Africa is not the history of South Africa, it's the history of white people in South Africa. They did not tell the fact that long before the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck, our people were living in the land of plenty. We had control over our own land. We knew how to use our own minerals. We had control over all the animals. We knew the differentiation between domestic animals and wild animals. We had our own lives. There was no underdevelopment before the colonial settlers came here. That is why when they came, they took our land and forced black people into wage labor. Do you know when the mines started, black people refused to go and work in the mines. They said there's no need. Why should we be paid a salary for what? We are living well. But the colonial system had to introduce taxes on black people to say now you are obliged to pay tax. And that was a means of forcing our people to go and engage in wage labor, to be extensions of machines, to be extensions of shafts. So when the colonial settlers came here, we had our own lives. We were not underdeveloped as Africans. We had our own lives. But an impression is created that this was a barbarian society. They were eating each other. They did not have any form of system. They even hide some critical components of their own history. Because before the Dutch colonized South Africa, there was an attempt by the Portuguese to colonize South Africa by a person called Francisco de Almeida. There was an attempt to take over the land of the indigenous people here in South Africa. And Francisco de Almeida was defeated by the people in 1510. So you can calculate between 1510 and 1652. It's more than 100 years. But when they want to justify their continued theft, when they want to justify their continued occupation and settlement in our land, they say we started in 1652. They do not want to acknowledge that they subjected our people of genocide. That is why at the center of every struggle must be the repossession of our land. At the center of our struggle is the repossession of our land, our animals without compensation. That is what must define our struggle at all times. Because for us, development was that unity which we had with the land. And they divorced us by violence from our land. We need to reclaim our land as part of what we need to do. And you would know they came to settle here. From 1652, they were joined by the British settlements. They fought amongst themselves. The Boers and the English fought amongst themselves, but reached an agreement in 1910. I want to give this clearer context so that we understand where we come from. Then they agreed amongst themselves in the late 1800s that let's work together as whites to constitute a white-only government. We will call it the Union of South Africa, which they launched on the 31st of May 1910. So this thing called South Africa was a product of white males only discussion and agreement that said, let us constitute this occupied territory of black people into white man's land. And when they did so, they already defeated and pushed our people to just 7% of the land here in South Africa. And they through colonization, through colonialism, supported by Britain, supported by the so-called Queen, which this city used to be named after. They used to terrorize our people. You know, if you refuse people the right to vote, if you refuse people the right to have a say in their future, you are basically refusing that they are human beings. If you refuse workers, black workers, to organize themselves into unions, you are basically refusing that these people are human beings. So whites never accepted that we are human beings. Majority still don't, even to this day. They think we do not deserve anything. That is why majority of the times when we say we want our land back, they say, what do you want to do with the land? And we do not owe any explanation to any white person on what we want to do with our land. It's our land. That is where we came from. And of course, in response to the 1910 Union of South Africa, there was an attempt by black elites to respond through the formation of the South African Natives National Congress, which is currently the ANC, 1912. So you can see the logic that 31st May 1910, and then they got to only meet in 1912 in January because they were trying to meet as soon as possible. But at the center of the formation of the SANNC, the South African Natives National Congress, was not to fight for the reclamation of our land. Don't be misled by anyone. No historian, no person who is honest must ever tell you that the SANNC was formed to fight for the land. They were fighting to be accommodated within the white settler colonial system. That is what they were formed for. Their methods of struggle was to write petitions and to send delegation to the Queen to say, we are your subjects, oh dear Queen. Please allow some of us who are educated. Please allow the civilized black men some rights in your territory called South Africa. This is not fiction. This is pure, proper historical fact. So sometimes we must not be very shocked when the ANC, every time they speak, they want to please the masters. They want to please the imperialist forces. They want to please the Queen, because that is what they were formed to do. There was once, of course, a turning point in 1944 when the Congress Youth League was founded. Under the clarion call of freedom in our lifetime, under the leadership of Anton Buziwaki Lambede of Congress Party, of Robert Richard of Mxolisi Majombozi, of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, of course of Nelson Mandela, of Oliver Tambo. Their agenda was to say, we are now demanding our land back. We are demanding that each and every black person must be acknowledged and recognized as a human being. We want one vote, one person. Because before that, the SANC was not demanding one person, one vote. The one person, one vote was only demanded by Anton Muziwa Kilambede, who said, this is our nation, this is our country. And when the system realized that this demand is gaining traction amongst the people, they began to infiltrate far much earlier the Congress movement to shape its character, to shape its military philosophy. Later on, when they went into adopting the armed struggle, what was the military philosophy of Umkhonto weSizwe? Was that don't kill white people. White people who continue to kill defenseless black people. Every day, everywhere. White people who used to kill black people in farms. The response was that instead of fighting back to defend yourself, let's go and bomb bridges and power lines and all of those things. That was the military philosophy, because white lives mattered. In exile, Umkhonto weSizwe killed a lot of black people amongst themselves. They used to declare people spies and kill them. Umkhonto weSizwe used to be hired as mercenaries to fight wars that had nothing to do with the South African liberation struggle. They did not have a problem with killing black people. But if you ever suggest that let's retaliate against the apartheid system by fighting the soldiers and kill them, you are never going to find any favor from those that led Umkhonto weSizwe. They respected white lives. They had no respect of black people's lives. That is what they were defined with in terms of what happened. That is why later on, when there was a process to hand over just part of political power to black people, the system had no problem with the South African Natives National Congress. They knew that amongst these people are our spies, the people that we have planted there. You would know that from the 1970s, when there was no political activity, when all political movements, all liberation forces were banned in South Africa, the only clarion call came from Steve Biko, who was leading the Black Consciousness movement. Steve Biko died at the age of 31, but he was able to be the rallying force and the rallying voice, the clarion call of all black people in South Africa. Almost everyone who joined politics in the 1960s was joining the Black Consciousness movement. Almost everyone. The June 16, 1976 uprising of young people was inspired and led by the Black Consciousness movement. And the militancy shown there was condemned by the South African Natives National Congress. So students of history must go and check, and you will realize that after June 1976, the South African Natives National Congress, the ANC in exile, in hiding, they were not in exile, they were hiding. They issued a statement to say we condemn the recklessness of these students. That was their response in terms of what happened. So you had people who were hiding in Angola, in Tanzania, in Uganda, in Nigeria, who thought they've got the moral authority to tell students how to fight against the nonsensical apartheid system. When they were not doing anything, they were just learning songs there. So the only thing you can gain from majority of those people is to sing as many songs as possible. Politics, nothing. Ideology, nothing. But every day they speak now, they say that they want to be treated specially because themselves they fought for freedom. Fought for freedom when? The people who were confronting the system were those that remained here in South Africa. Were those that were rallying behind Mama Winnie Nomzamo Mandela. Those are the ones who confronted the system. And none of them saying that we want special houses as veterans of the struggle. But you find MK soldiers who have never fired a single bullet to any direction, even to the sky, demanding houses for free, demanding tenders, threatening people. But also it reveals a simple fact. What kind of a soldier who is fighting for liberation, and when liberation, so-called liberation has happened, you want to demand personal glory and personal benefits, because the struggle is waged on behalf of the people, not for yourself. It's not about you. We wage the struggle on behalf of the people, not for self-enrichment. That is why Thomas Sankara was saying, and correctly said, that a soldier without proper ideological and political training is a potential criminal. We have criminals who demand self-entitlement now because they were hiding in Angola, in Uganda, and Tanzania. That is what we were dealing with in terms of all of these issues. Now, when apartheid realized that it is no longer profitable for the big businesses, the Anglo-Americans, the Ruperts, when they realized that there is now beginning to be consciousness and awareness in many parts of the world, there's beginning to be sanctions. South Africa is being isolated. They then said that because these minerals that we're digging here have to be sold in the international market, maybe we must substitute a white government and replace it with a black government, but continue to do business as usual. Actually, one of the employees of Anglo-American, called Gqeberha, said in 1987 that let us facilitate a process where negotiation must work, the rhetoric must be dropped, reality prevails, and we will continue to do business as usual. This so-called transition was engineered by capital. Of course, capital felt the power of the masses, who were saying an end to apartheid. But in terms of the details and the content and form of South Africa's transition from apartheid to what we have now was engineered by white capital. They determined the content of what must be discussed in Gqeberha. When de Klerk announced the release of Nelson Mandela and banning of political parties, and release of many political prisoners, he did say that the system of capitalism must continue. You can see that that was the content of the agenda that determined the transition from apartheid to so-called democracy. And they did that. They signed a lot of agreements with the International Monetary Fund, with the World Bank, and the WTO. It was called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. They sold our country before they could hand it over partially to black people. Our country was traded like that just take political power, but don't disrupt our colonial agreements. Part of those agreements is a simple thing that in 1910, when the whites were forming this union of South Africa, they said, let us have separate capital cities. Let us have Cape Town on behalf of the Cape Colony as a legislative capital. Let us have Pretoria representing Transvaal as an administrative capital. Let us have Bloemfontein representing the Orange River Colony as a judicial capital. And let us complete a railway project in Maritzburg, KwaZulu-Natal representing the Natal Colony. When we gained the so-called freedom, we are still bound by that colonial agreement. We are still bound by a constitution that says that if you want to take the land, only take the land that was taken post 19 June 1913. And by 1913, 19th June, when they passed the Land Act, the colonial settlers had taken 93% of South Africa. Go and read your constitution, the so-called constitution, which is celebrated by white people all over the world. So when they say the constitution of South Africa is celebrated, it's white people who are saying that it looks like that white territory of ours is still safe. Because the Constitution of South Africa, Section 25, subsection 7, says if you want to restitute the land, if you want to redistribute the land, you must only talk about the land that was taken after the 19th of June 1930. That is absolute rubbish. That is what the EFF is trying to change in Parliament. That is what the ANC is refusing to change in Parliament. They claim to be agreeing with us, but now when we deal with the details, we realize that these sellouts are not agreeing on expropriation of land without compensation. And we caution them, we'll continue to caution them, that if they don't change the constitution, we are not going to vote with them in their sell-out amendment. But also, we are going to think very strongly of whether we must not just take back our land, whether there's a paper called constitution or not. As black people, we must start to think about that. Our resolution from the First National People's Assembly said we must occupy unoccupied land. Maybe we must look into, can't we take back some of this land even if it's occupied? We must start to think about that. Because we have been talking for a very long time. It says in the founding manifesto of the EFF that we are going to take power through democratic means. but also by any other revolutionary means possible. Maybe we must ask that question. On this so-called Freedom Day, whether can't we take back our land? Let's adopt a different model. Let's look into it in terms of what should happen. It's one of the issues, comrades, that we must deal with in a much more different way. The transition from apartheid to so-called democracy was engineered in form, content, and shape by the white capitalist establishment. They were substituting white politicians with black politicians. And then they continue to loot our resources, to exploit our resources, to exploit black people. That is what defines our so-called democracy. That is what defines the so-called freedom that we are celebrating or supposed to celebrate here in South Africa. The other issue, comrades, that we have to talk to is this issue of South Africa having been decolonized. Do you know when the apartheid government took power, they declared something called Unilateral Declaration of Independence, where they stopped sending formal reports to the British Parliament. So before 1948, and majority of the times from 1910, some of the laws in South Africa had to be approved by the British Parliament as a colonial master. And then when the Afrikaners took power to intensify apartheid, they claimed that they are decolonizing from the British colony and colonial control. But in reality, there was never decolonization of this place we call South Africa today. Even 1994 was not a decolonization of South Africa. There are two proper concepts that define our current state in relation to colonialism. One is that we are defined by neo-colonialism, but also are defined by coloniality. Kwame Nkrumah says the essence of neo-colonialism is that the state which is subject to it is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. South Africa's economic policy is not independent of multinational control, multinational corporations control. They use the IMF loans and debt conditionalities to tell us which policies we must adopt. They use the World Bank to micromanage the economic policy of South Africa. They use rating agencies to determine the content of economic policy here in South Africa. So rating agencies are instruments of neo-colonialism. To say, if you do not do the following, we're going to downgrade you. And the following is their economic policy. You must check the coincidence of the notes of rating agencies and what National Treasury says is economic policy. It's the same thing. It's cut and paste directly. So South Africa is a neo-colonial state. We do not have the independence which we claim to be celebrating. We are a neo-colony of the global system of capitalism, but also are defined by coloniality. It's not a difficult thing. So colonization is when another country is in full control of another country, all its policies. But coloniality is what happens after the political system, the administrative control has been left. What colonization brings or lives in a society that it used to colonize is coloniality, that everything else that you continue to do post-colonization still reflects the agenda of those that colonized you before. That is what it is. And many parts of the world are defined by that phenomenon. Our understanding of everything, so even what we are taught when you say you want to have decolonial education, it's an education system that does not see the world only according to Europeans. So now, according to Europeans, development, it means that all of us must have jobs, must be attached to industries, must be extensions of factories. We must have money, cash. But development in a decolonial context means that we must be reunified with our land. We must be able to produce for ourselves. But the colonial system teaches us development that says we must always think of development as being employed by a white company who must not do things for ourselves. Coloniality determines the content of our laws and our judicial system. Students of law, you will know that the first chapter in Laws 101, they will say to you that our legal system is based on Roman Dutch law. So that is coloniality in action, where our laws are still determined even when the colonizers are no longer control of this territory which they used to control for many years. Amongst ourselves, black lecturers, black students, we pride ourselves for memorizing Roman Dutch law. That is coloniality. That is what 1994 did not defeat and did not even try to defeat. Coloniality also shapes how we understand how the land question must be dealt with. In proper decolonial context, land is always commonly owned. That is why the founding manifesto of the EFF says the land must be under the custodianship of the state so that we can gain equal access to it. But under colonial systems, there must be freehold and these title deeds. So Ramaphosa goes to people who are landless and give them pieces of paper and say, I'm giving you land, when it's just giving them a piece of paper without having shifted anyone from that land. But the manner in which we understand land tenure in South Africa is still within coloniality, and we are not changing that. The language that we speak with here is still defined by coloniality. They are gone now. But we speak their language. The manner in which we relate with God is defined by coloniality. That is what
it's all about. So to say that South Africa has been decolonized is an overstatement. Everything as the control of our economy is still colonial. The manner in which we deal with health care and medicines is squarely located in coloniality. It is not true that indigenous medicines and health systems are demonic. It is not true that indigenous African healthcare systems and medicines cannot cure diseases. But we are told every day that the only way to cure ourselves is through Western medicine. Because we are still living in a colonial system. We are still the colonial subjects. Our mannerisms are defined by that. The manner in which we conduct ourselves, the manner in which we conduct matrimonial issues of weddings, everything was defined by that, because colonization might have left, but coloniality continues to define all of us. And at the center of coloniality, it's universities and institutions of higher learning that are positioned to reproduce coloniality and colonial subjects. Who will master white mannerisms and white systems of knowledge when they do not know their own things? That is what we are dealing with. We have, as a generation, an obligation. We have a task to complete the struggles that was started by our forebearers. We must take the spear from Kwame Nkrumah, from Julius Nyerere, from Thomas Sankara, from Amilcar Cabral, from Anton Muziwake Lembede, from Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, to fight for the true freedom of our people. Because if all you know, if all you understand are European systems, you are being divorced from yourself. You are being alienated from yourself. Medical doctors are produced by institutions of higher learning. When they go back to their community, they don't know how to explain to a person who can't speak English on how they must take care of themselves, on how to administer primary health care, on how to prevent diseases. Because the system that we have embraced has produced colonial subjects. Yet, we must celebrate the so-called freedom. We need to liberate ourselves, comrades. We must decolonize ourselves. We should, of course, fight for political power, but that must not be the end state. We must fight for economic power. We must decolonize the entirety of the African continent. These small enclaves called countries were designed by colonialism, and we take pride out of those ourselves. This one is Mozambican, this one is Zimbabwean, this one is Malawian. Those things were just demarcated now in the 1800s, in the late 1800s. And you even begin to believe that there is physical differences between us and other Africans. Because that is what colonialism taught us, to hate ourselves. We were taught by colonialism to hate ourselves. If you hate your African brother and sister, You hate yourself. You are a colonial subject. And that is what we need to fight and change in terms of what should happen. We have got a very long struggle ahead of us. Our journey is very long ahead of us. But we must never be tired. We must never surrender. We must never retreat. Now, for us to win all these battles, for us to achieve true freedom, for us to achieve true decolonial freedom, we need to have a revolution. And revolution is led by revolutionaries in a revolutionary movement. The problem is that this colonial system and even ourselves, we fall easily into the trap of juniorization. We juniorize ourselves. We think we're children who cannot do things for ourselves. At the age of 20, 21 upward, you are an adult. Just gauge just how much Steve Biko achieved by the age of 31. We still speak about Steve Biko today. He wrote books, he led a national movement. And he left this earth at the age of 31. But you will find a 40-year-old chairperson of a branch of the EFF saying, I don't have resources to call a meeting. 40 years old. Now we're trying to mobilize your leadership, but we don't have resources. We need t-shirts first. How are you a revolutionary if you are still complaining about resources? Steve Biko lived under apartheid. He was not from a rich family. He was able to reproduce himself. Robert Sobukwe came never from a rich family. He was able to reproduce his ideas. That the system was so fearful of him. Thomas Sankara does not come from a rich family. There is nowhere in the theory of Amilcar Cabral where it says before you convince people, you must give them t-shirts first. It's nowhere. We have an obligation to take ourselves much more seriously. We cannot just complain. We are making an observation of what happened before us. We're here now. Do we want to leave this legacy for our children and great children? It's possible, comrades, fighters, it's possible that 30 years from now, 50 years from now, white people will still be in ownership and control of the land if we do not do anything. It's possible that your children and their children and their children's children will still be working as domestic workers and garden boys of white people. We can go, all of us who are here, we can die in the next 100 years. And we'll still have a system of white supremacy, of white privilege, if we do not do anything. If we do not self-actualize into conscious revolutionaries. You can't be a revolutionary who every day you think of doing something. You see an opportunity to extort money or some benefits from people that you are helping or from the leadership. Every time you meet with leadership, now we need money for this. Money for what? Go and speak to people that you can reach. Because this revolution that we are in now, at least this phase that we are in, it needs us to have numbers. We must be many. In a revolution, size matters. I don't know where it doesn't matter, but in a revolution, size matters. The number of people that follow you. In a revolution, size matters. And how do we get to be many? We must ideologically and politically reproduce ourselves. We must not be too quick to complain. We must not be too quick to apportion blame to others. We must not be too quick to speak bad of fellow fighters. So all of us, comrades, must be on the ground. We are going to elections on the 27th of October. We should come back with something significant. We must win Nelson Mandela Bay. We must win. We must win in Buffalo City. We must win in KSD. We must win everywhere we are. We must have the necessary impact. And we want to call on you students that be involved in the struggles of the EFF. Majority of the times, I'm giving the example of Steve Biko. When he was leading the whole country of black people, he was a student leader. He led a movement of all black people when he was a student leader. And if you think that your revolution only ends in campus, it doesn't involve the people in the informal settlements, then you are not a revolutionary. You will not grow even as a leader if you think that you are going to only organize and concentrate in the university. You must remember that in the university, your task is just to mobilize people to a meeting, is to mobilize people to vote for you. The university has already organized those people for you. So, but if you live there, whenever you've got time, instead of going to Gqeberha, you must join the door-to-door programs of the EFF in all the areas. You must join the struggle to convince our people that we need true freedom. You can't be calling yourself a student leader who every time there is space, the only thing is to go to Shebins. You must go to the ground. It actually will give you a far much more clearer and better perspective of what should happen. Also, comrades, let us stop this impatience of governance here in Nelson Mandela. If truly you want to be government, let us go to the ground and convince our people that we want to be government. Our aim for the coming elections must be to win 100% alone, without any black caucus, without any coalition arrangement. You can't be government when you are 6 people in a municipality of 120 councillors. You can't be. You must go and persuade our people. Our people always respond. Our people always respond when spoken to. And if that is difficult for you as leaders, you must tell us on time. that this for me leadership is very difficult. And then you step aside with then get volunteers who will go on the ground to do work of the organization. We said, the president said yesterday that the immediate task, which I want to remind you, is that all branches of the EFF should have gone to their branch, peoples and general assemblies before the end of May. And the region here, Nelson Mandela, should have gone to his regional people's assembly to elect leadership before the end of June. Our target here, Nelson Mandela, must be to go to the regional people's assembly in the first weekend of June, so that we can immediately start the program of consolidating the ground towards election victory. Because we are not going to participate in elections for the sake of participation. We are participating with the aim of winning. We must remove this white minority government here. Because now but the mayor is nothing, it's just a puppet of white controllers. It's one of the experiments of the DA. They're going to throw him out when they're done with him. The DA has decided to define itself as an exclusively white organization. That is why 91% of white voters vote for the DA. The less said about the ANC, the better. They went to a conference in Nazareth, took so many resolutions. They took a resolution on expropriation of land without compensation. They took a resolution on creation of a state bank, on creation of a sovereign wealth fund. They took a resolution on nationalization of the Reserve Bank. But the only resolution they are known for now is to step aside of this one or that one. That is what they talk about every day. You will never hear them talk about things that affect the people. They are busy engaged in palace politics, of backstabbing each other, of saying, who must steal now? Who must steal more now? We do not care what they do to each other. But there's an agenda which we must pursue. As black people in South Africa, we must fight for the return of our land. That must be a mission that we must win. We must fight for the control of our wealth. How do you explain that 27 years after so-called democratic dispensation, there is not a single bank that is owned by black people? That thing of Patrice Motsepe of Time Bank is not a bank, it's a toy bank. Real banks are still owned and controlled by the white minority. All the retail chain stores, Pick and Pay, ShopRite, Boxer, all of those things, Spar, all of them are still owned by the white minority. And who buys from those? It's us. Just imagine how many billions do we hand over to the white minority every day as black people? There is 200 billion rands that is given to our people as social grants. They receive it on the day of receiving and immediately give it back to the white establishment. That is what defines us. It cannot be like that forever. Everything else that we live for is to enrich and further enrich white people it is possible for such a system to remain with us forever. And we should, as a generation, refuse that we cannot live under a neo-colonial, racist, capitalist, and incapable state. We want to overthrow this government is not a secret. They are fighting back with everything. They look for everything that we do. They try to criminalize the leadership every day because they know that what we are speaking and what we stand for is the truth. But as ourselves here as activists, we must make sure that we take the truth to our people. And not just through social media. Social media is fine. Let's engage, let's shape the discourse. But let us go on the ground and interact with our people. Let us be seen on the ground with our people. There must not be a voting district here in Nelson Mandela Bay, in the whole province, where there is less than 50 volunteers and ground forces of the EFF. We must be everywhere. And I can assure you that if you take time to talk to our people, they will listen to you and they will honor you. They will give you a chance because they've been messed around for 27 years. They've been promised so many things. When Mandela took over in 1994, he said he's going to build 10 million houses for the homeless Africans within the first 10 years. It's 27 years now. Not even 4 million houses were built for our people. And even those houses are not proper for our people. Go and check in the history archives. The ANC had posters all over South Africa saying you vote for the ANC, there's going to be free education for all. Is there free education now? No. They will go back to our people, promise the same thing. And if there is no alternate voice of the EFF, they are going to come back to power and continue to loot our resources. If we put the EFF in government, you are rest assured that freedom, true freedom, is going to come. We are going to cancel all the student debt. How do you refuse to give a black poor student their degree certificate, their diploma certificate, because they owe you money which they will never pay you? They don't have the money. They don't have the job. At least that paper can make it easier for them to get a job. And then you create locked rooms and safes in universities and lock certificates, degrees and diplomas of poor black students. Whatever you do, you will never get any money because they are from poor households. They do not have the money. What do you seek to achieve? You will never ever get the money. Why do you deprive the future of black kids? Because you say they owe you 5,000 rand. And it has been years now. That is why we have tabled in Parliament a legislation that will end up in cancelling all student debts, so that our students, those that have gone through the system, must get their degrees, their diplomas, their certificates. But the permanent solution must be fee-free decolonial education for all, so that all of us can realize economic freedom in our lifetime. Amandla! Amandla! Awethu! Bathule nje baziqiniso. Awule ndawo